Good evening, everybody. My name is Bill Blaikie, and I'm the person in charge of the Knowles Woodsworth lecture. And I'll just stand back a bit. Some of you may know, because I see some familiar faces in the crowd, this is the seventh annual Knowles Woodsworth lecture, but it's actually happened over a period of about 9 years. So sometimes you can't get it happening in the fall, so it goes over into the next year, etc., depending on the guest speaker. And it's an opportunity to bring people in to speak about the relationship between religion and politics, the two things that we're never supposed to talk about. Tonight we're going to talk about them together. And we're very pleased to have with us today Jim Winkler, who's the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in the United States of America. Has come here, flown here today from Washington. I thought that, as some of you may have noticed, interesting things are happening south of the border, and that it might be useful to have someone who might be able to shed some light on what's happening south of the border, but also in particular from the point of view of someone who's very active within the Christian faith community there. So I'm very happy that Jim agreed to come, and like every one of you, I'm looking forward to what he has to say. Afterwards, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A and discussion. But right now, Jim, thank you very much for being here.
Good evening. It's great to be here. My first time in Winnipeg, and it's awful cold here. I think I'm going to begin by disappointing you, because throughout 2016, I kept getting asked a question by church leaders who would come to the United States, such as leaders of the Cuban Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches of Korea, Middle East Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, all Canadian Council of Churches, all groups that we work closely with, and they would all ask me, can Donald Trump really get elected president? No, I said, not a chance. Over and over and over, I said, not a chance. So you're going to have to take everything I say tonight with a grain of salt. And it could be that my descriptive abilities are no better than my predictive abilities. But you should also know that I did not applaud during Trump's recent State of the Union address, and that may well mark me in his eyes as being guilty of treason. And so I was thinking that I ought to seek political asylum while I'm up here. Yeah, I hope so. But this afternoon, I was walking around and my ears were freezing. I thought, now I have to go home and face the firing squad. It's too much. But we have a bizarre situation that we're experiencing in the United States. No doubt about it. And since I've been asked to speak of Christianity in Trump's America, it is equally bizarre to me that a significant number of so-called evangelical Christians are unquestioningly and enthusiastically endorsing and supporting a president who is a notorious liar, a thrice divorced womanizer, an adulterer, an indifferent Christian at best, and one who has periodically altered his positions on questions that are dear to their heart. And I say so-called evangelicals because evangelical really means of or according to the teaching of the gospel. Or we sometimes think of it as meaning the good news of the gospel. So this is really a moniker that's been attached to more conservative Christians, of course, in the United States. Our religious scene in the United States is complex, and it's growing ever more so. When I was a young person, we were basically thought of ourselves as Christians and Jews. In fact, those of us who are Protestants used to say that there were Christians, Catholics and Jews. We got past that point. It said Catholics and Christians, or Protestants were all Christian. But now we have a very diverse community of believers in the United States, I think similar to what you're experiencing here. I work now for 30 years on Capitol Hill in a building across the street from the Supreme Court in the Capitol called the United Methodist Building. It's owned by the United Methodist Church. But in there we have the offices of the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the United Church of Christ, the National Council of Churches, and a host of organizations. We also now house the Islamic Society for North America, we're all grouped in what we call the Washington Interreligious Staff Community. We have various working groups, a domestic human needs working group. We have a working group on drones. We have a working group on healthcare and so forth, where the faith community, our staff, and our experts come together, analyze the public policy, the legislation before Congress, and try to build some kind of consensus among ourselves. Well, over this 30 years, that community has also expanded from basically being Christians and Jews to having now Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Zoroastrians. We're all together around the table. And for the most part, we actually agree with one another, especially on issues of racism and poverty and hunger and homelessness, economic justice and environmental justice. There's a few issues here and there where we don't always see eye to eye. But it is there is a lot of consensus in that community. The evangelical community tends to operate separately. You might think of the National Association of Evangelicals, for example, as being the center of evangelical Christianity in the United States. But the truth is that over the last 20 or 25 years, the National Association of Evangelicals, which was actually created in opposition to the National Council of Churches that I lead in 1941, because they saw us as dangerously left-wing, that group has become almost the left edge of the evangelical community in the U.S. So things are changing rapidly. There was also a time where evangelical churches were growing and mainline Protestant churches, as we sometimes refer to them, were shrinking. This, of course, encouraged evangelicals to feel that they had the right theology and we had the wrong theology. It was obvious since our churches were shrinking and theirs were growing. Now their churches are shrinking as well. And the fastest group of believers in the United States are called the nuns. Not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. And so this phenomenon of the rise of the nuns has caught the attention of sociologists and demographers in recent years. These are young people, particularly, not exclusively, who say, I believe in God, but I am none of the above. I don't consider myself a part of any organized Christian denomination, and I don't want to be. Now we also have the rise of the Duns, D-O-N-E-S. These are older folks who have remained faithful to the church in a variety of denominations, but are tired of being on all the committees at church. And they said, I'm done. I'm just done. So, one of the reasons, in my view, that we've seen such a growth of diversity, not only religiously in our country, but in terms of our ethnicity, is due to the 1965 Immigration Act. If I can back up a little bit, there was a 1924 Immigration Act in the United States that was pushed very strongly by white Protestant denominations. Those white Protestant denominations, one of which I grew up in, the United Methodist Church, were resistant to the influx of Catholics and Jews coming into the U.S. in the late 19th, early 20th century. So they persuaded Congress, with also the assistance of the Ku Klux Klan, to push for a very restrictive Immigration Act. So much so that it was very difficult for refugees from the Holocaust to make it into the United States during World War II. And it wasn't until 1965 that a more relaxed immigration policy was adopted. Now, the legislative history on that is that Congress was of the opinion that Northern Europeans would resume coming to the United States. But those countries were recovering from World War II, the Depression was over, and for the most part, we humans don't see any need to leave our land and go to another country if our own nation is doing well. So who came to the United States? Well, people from Africa and Asia and Latin America in particular. And suddenly, our country became much more diverse. When I was a kid, if you wanted ethnic food, you went to either get Mexican food, pizza, or Chinese. Now you can get everything. And as I've been here in Winnipeg, I see the same thing here in this city. It's remarkable the change that's taking place for some of us in our own lifetimes. This is, of course, also reflected in the religious diversity in our country. So I say all of this because even if Donald Trump successfully manages to stop all immigration into the United States, it will not alter the fact that the United States is and will continue to become more diverse in the years ahead. A word about the National Council of Churches. I talked about the mainline churches, but the National Council of Churches is more complex than that. We have 7 African American Methodist and Baptist denominations within the NCC. We have 9 Orthodox churches, such as the Armenian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Serbian Orthodox, and others. We have peace churches, the Quakers and the Brethren, and we have some smaller denominations that you might not be particularly familiar with, such as the Swedenborgian Church or the Hungarian Reformed Church. So it's a complex slice of American Christianity in the Protestant and Orthodox tradition. The NCC owns the copyright to the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. We produce Sunday school curriculum. We carry out interreligious dialogues. We have a Hindu Christian, a Buddhist Christian, a Muslim Christian, and a Jewish Christian dialogue. We carry out what we call faith and order conversations, where we talk about our differences on doctrine and theology and practices in our churches. And we also speak to social and political issues. But I point that out because sometimes folks think, oh, the NCC only focuses on social justice issues or on political matters. And that's not the case. But I would say this. Over the last 60 years or so, the churches within the National Council of Churches have undergone a tremendous shift. I pointed out to Bill earlier that of the 45 presidents in the United States, arguably all but one, John Kennedy, Roman Catholic, were part of churches that make up the NCC. So it sounds like we're tremendously powerful and influential. And indeed, these churches were the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Lutherans and a number of other denominations. These were, you might say, the pillars of the establishment. But with the rise of Dr. King in the 1950s, and the African American churches with the NCC began confronting the white churches about racism, about practices of meeting in segregated hotels and cities, it awakened the conscience of the white churches, and they became committed to and involved in the civil rights struggle. That provoked a backlash in many of these churches. For example, the National Council of Churches became involved in the Delta Ministry in Mississippi, which was intended to create some black economic empowerment. Well, white churches that were still part of the National Council of Churches said, why are these northern liberals coming in and messing with our comfortable situation? We're dealing with race here at our own speed and our own way, and they're messing up the whole situation. So there was a backlash. Hard on the heels of the civil rights struggle was, of course, the Vietnam War. And the council and its member churches, the council is the member churches, began to speak early and often against the Vietnam War. And then came the women's movement, the environmental justice movement, the anti-apartheid movement. and the LGBTQ movement, all kinds of social justice movements that have dramatically changed the face of our nation and the face of religion in this country. So, as we talk about faithful resistance and prophetic persistence, this has been going on for quite some time. It predates Donald Trump. It's not as if suddenly we got upset at some of the policies that he's undertaken or trying to implement. It's been a long process in which the churches have gone from being, as I said, the pillars of the establishment to questioning the very direction in which the nation, or you might say the empire, is headed. This has gone in fits and starts. It is by no means unanimous. I am a member of a local church in Alexandria, Virginia, where I have zero doubt that on any given Sunday we have a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans in church. And many of these mainline churches that are often described as liberal denominations are very proud of the fact that in most local churches across the country you have that kind of diversity. So in a lot of the evangelical congregations, it's pretty much Republican. And in perhaps some denominations, it's pretty much Democrats, such as African American denominations. But in these white mainline churches, you've got a lot of diversity, and that's valued, especially in the midst of a country that's increasingly polarized. And this means that as we arrive at and advocate for social justice positions, it's done knowing that this is not widely held or unanimously held by everybody. But if I may also say, in most of these denominations, these public policy stances, arrived at through a lot of conversation, study, prayer, debate over the course of many years, have been determined through democratic processes. So delegates to the highest decision-making bodies are elected through local churches and then through regional bodies so that they serve at the national level. And I have found that those who have been elected to represent their denomination at the national level have usually been chosen by their peers, their fellow church members, because their faith is strong, they're intelligent, they're curious, they're thoughtful, and they're trusted to come to these decisions. However, when you're in a national setting, you quickly realize this is different than my local church. It may be that everybody in my local church supports the death penalty, or pretty much everybody in my local church opposes the death penalty. But now I am asked to make the decision, what should my whole church, the Church of Jesus Christ, lived out through a denominational expression, what should my church say about this? It's bigger than me and my thoughts, it's bigger than my local church. This requires me now to grapple with my faith. And this has meant that over time, folks have said, nuclear weapons are wrong. Growing inequality between the rich and the poor is wrong. An economy that destroys the earth, there's something wrong with that. We've got to try to change this situation. Now, in the U.S., you often hear about separation of church and state. And we value separation of church and state. The National Council of Churches is among the faith groups who believe very strongly in that. We're not among those churches that say that separation of church and state is a fiction. This is an increasing point of view. This is a wrong interpretation of history. There was never any intention to separate church and state. The founding fathers were actually evangelical Christians. This is a widely propagated point of view these days. We're not those churches. For example, we don't support state-sponsored school prayer. We're okay with prayer in school. I prayed in school a lot, especially as those tests were being handed out to me. But that's different from state-sponsored prayer. We are among those churches that don't want tax money that we all pay into, whether we're Muslims or Methodists or Mormons. We don't want the tax money put into church funds, at least not in a way that enables churches to proselytize. Just as I don't want my tax money used for the propagation of Christianity, neither do I want my tax money used for the propagation of Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Hinduism. So we have and we stand in favor of separation of church and state. But Martin Luther King Jr. put it this way: the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. So we don't apologize for being in the middle of public policy debates. When we visit members of Congress in their offices, we offer a polite, firm, moral, and ethical witness. We don't go in and say, if you don't vote the way we want you to, we'll turn you out of office. We don't make those kind of threats. But we don't apologize for being in there and stating our views. As I think back on my life, my faith has been acted out in a variety of ways in terms of public policy, beyond just meeting with members of Congress or elected officials. I remember at the age of 11 in 1969, where my father was a pastor, our local church joined a march down to the post office where we sent letters to Richard Nixon calling for a moratorium on the bombing of North Vietnam. In 1982, when I was a young man, I was arrested outside the United Nations, the U.S. mission to the United Nations, in protest against nuclear weapons. Remember the nuclear freeze campaign? I was part of that. In college, I was involved in protests against apartheid and trying to persuade my university to sell stocks that it owned in companies that benefited from apartheid. In 2003, I was arrested across the street from the White House in a protest against the Iraq War that had just been launched. 2010, I was arrested in the rotunda of the Capitol in protest of budget cuts for programs that assist poor and needy people. And I'm going to be arrested again in May, along with Reverend William Barber and thousands of people across the country in a coordinated campaign we're calling the Poor People's Campaign, where we're going to have protests in every state capital, again, in protest of policies that harm the least, the last, and the lost among us. You're welcome to come down and join us. Several days ago, in fact, I joined the Poor People's Campaign for a press conference on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol. These were all people of faith who gathered. And a young dreamer, you've heard of the dreamers, who are now being threatened with deportation. She told her story of being brought to the United States as a child by her parents because her father was fleeing violence in Mexico. She said, "I am undocumented, unafraid, and unashamed." I like that phrase. I am undocumented, unafraid, and unashamed. And it's really because of people like her that we've joined in legal cases against the Trump administration's efforts to shut off the influx of refugees and immigrants into our country. So we don't want to see a rollback of the gains that we've made over these decades that have made our flawed country a better place. This is faithful resistance. Prophetic persistence means we have to advocate on behalf of those in need. Jesus taught us, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law, and all the prophets. Some call this the love commandments. And in a sense, sometimes I feel like we have two different ways that we're approaching our faith. Either a God of law or a God of love. The law God is a judgmental God, a wrathful God, a God that's angry. The loving God, the forgiving God, the merciful God is the one that I was raised believing in and that I believe is the true God. So we oppose any discrimination based on one's birth circumstances. And in fact, it amazes me when you think about it. So Mary and Joseph had to flee for their lives along with the infant child Jesus to Egypt to escape persecution. So the young people, the dreamers, who came to the United States as children of their parents, raised in this country, now face possible deportation. So when you think about it, Jesus was a dreamer. His parents had to flee this persecution. It seems to me that those Christians in the United States who insist the Bible should be the basis of our laws and our government should be the strongest advocates of the dreamers and refugees and immigrants. Now, those local churches in the United States that have declared themselves to be sanctuaries for refugees and immigrants are practicing faithful resistance. There's nearly 1,000 such congregations across the country. They're not all Christian, but some of them, such as Congregational United Church of Christ in Greensboro, North Carolina, or Arch Street United Methodist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or the Mountain View Friends Meeting in Denver, Colorado, or Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, are all churches that are part of the National Council of Churches. They are prophetically persistent. In fact, some of these churches have been sanctuary churches going back at least 30 and sometimes 40 years because they were protecting refugees who were fleeing the political violence in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala during the wars that the United States was supporting in those countries. We, Buddhists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Jews, Muslims, our Unitarians are also among those who are involved, and we're all connected through a sanctuary movement program. So whether you're Christian or not, there is this belief in the ethic of the love commandments. And we also oppose the idea that only some deserve God's mercy. I was taught to trust that God's love is for everyone and is not limited by anyone's prejudice. Whenever the Bible is used to hurt people or to subjugate others, it is not consistent with the laws of love. For centuries, the Bible was used wrongly to justify slavery, war, still is, mistreatment of women. It has been used to justify colonialism, shameful destruction of the earth, and hatred of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and queer people. Now, for many, this legacy means they want nothing further to do with Christianity. For others of us, the words of 1 John 4:8, whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love, are essential. So we prophetically persist as we seek an end to mass incarceration. The United States still incarcerates more people than any other nation, although we've seen a small drop in the number of people in prison. And of course, disproportionately, it is people of color who are in our prisons. Furthermore, our prison system has and is now becoming again more privatized under President Trump and Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General. People and corporations are growing rich over the misery of jail and prison time. This is shameful. There are those who wish to make our country great again or white again. They believe the most persecuted group in America is the Christian American patriot. And they confuse the cross and the flag. Make no mistake about it. That's what's behind the killings of the 9 Christians engaged in Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina a couple of years ago. Or the Nazis who surrounded a church in Charlottesville, Virginia last summer. Or this burgeoning alt-right movement. So that's why we in the National Council of Churches are embarking on a racial justice truth-telling initiative. And I think and hope all of you have received a copy of our flyer. of our rally that's going to take place on April 4th on the National Mall. We admire and are inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and process that you had here in Canada, and of those that took place in South Africa, in Guatemala, and Brazil, and elsewhere. And it's amazing to me that we've never had such a process in the United States. So we formed a commission of church leaders in the U.S. and National Council of Churches. And after they met a couple of times, they said, you know what? Before we start calling this a truth and reconciliation process, we need to start calling it a truth process, a racial justice truth-telling process. Because quite frankly, the white church is ready to go straight to reconciliation. And as some black church leaders have said, I don't even know how we can get to reconciliation when we never had conciliation. So we're going to focus on racial justice truth-telling. And this is going to be a challenging process, but we're going to launch it on April 4th to mark the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, our greatest dreamer. And we're going to move through a multi-year process in the context of the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent. And we are going to try to end racism. That's what we hear God calling us to do. That's what we're intent on doing. Some say it can't be done. We're determined to do it. As some of the African American, thank you. Now this is going to be a really hard process in the United States. You cannot build a country on the backs of slaves on land stolen from its native peoples and not eventually come to a reckoning, a hard reckoning. I'm not a scholar of world religions, but I know that they have a lot in common. Dr. King was an African-American Baptist preacher, but he had to go to the other side of the world and to a different faith tradition to solidify his conviction that nonviolent resistance was the right strategy. We seek to attain peace and understanding with others. The basic message across the great religions of the world is cease to do evil, learn to do good, defend the cause of the poor and oppressed, purify your mind, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All over the world, the faces of the living ones are alike. Our faiths are connected in ways that will lead us to love one another more. We are connected. Be persistent in the knowledge that loving one another is the better way. Now we fall short of these ideals, but together we can move forward. We've got a long way to go to end racism, but let's be honest, we've mostly eradicated slavery. The Me Too movement has brought some change away from the idea that women are objects and are available for sexual harassment. If not for the churches within the National Council of Churches, there wouldn't be women serving in clergy. So we've come some ways along the path with a long way to go. When we gather as a unified voice, such as the Poor People's Campaign or a number of others in the U.S., we know things will happen. We can let God determine who's in and who's out. But we have the opportunity, the awareness, the wisdom, the innovation, and the technology to achieve the human and moral imperative of working for a better world, to make it on earth as it is in heaven. Now, we've sent young men and women to Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere to do terrible things that resulted in the deaths of thousands, indeed millions, of innocent people. We spend some $700 billion a year on a war machine and maintain hundreds of military bases and installations around the world. And I know we cannot and will not find peace through security and through weapons and war and spying and hatred and death. I know that a national security state eats away the liberties and soul of the very nation it purports to protect. I know there is a great sickness that pervades my nation. I know it sounds naive to assert that loving our neighbors and truth-telling and visiting the sick and clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and visiting the prisoners and welcoming the refugees and immigrants and caring for the earth and engaging in peacemaking sounds weak and silly. But it's time we take an honest look at ourselves before we look anywhere else. I must say I oppose the notion of American exceptionalism, the idea that God has chosen the United States for a higher purpose. But I recognize that at least it provides the opportunity to argue the nation must hold up high ideals, such as freedom and justice and democracy and human dignity and religious liberty. But America First is simply based on the notion that the U.S. must win all the time in everything, whether it's trade or weapons or wealth or insults. The churches that make up the National Council of Churches do the things that I mentioned. We visit the sick and feed the hungry. We shelter the homeless and clothe the naked. We visit the imprisoned. And we seek to free the oppressed. That's the hard part of the equation. The public policy stances we advocate have been arrived at, as I mentioned, through prayer and study and discernment. Some say, the church doesn't know. You don't have expertise in these issues. You don't know how to address these matters. These are complex. Let folks who have expertise do this. Well, quite frankly, many of the people who are elected to these positions are part of our churches. There's obviously some degree of intelligence and expertise that arose out of the churches if we have people in positions of power. Why is it that those of us who don't hold elective office are incapable of speaking to these issues? I know we're smart enough to know a few things. Racism is wrong. Throwing the dreamers out of our nation is wrong. Giving vast tax breaks to the wealthy is wrong. Turning away immigrants and refugees is wrong. Suggesting the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville are good people is wrong. Referring to Haiti and to all of Africa as a shithole is wrong. We're trying to head off what would be a disastrous war with North Korea. We're seeking a just resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're working to lift the Cuban blockade. And we have drawn a circle of protection around human needs programs. We're working to end mass incarceration. We want an end to gun violence. We want to dismantle the national security state. We want our nation to be fully committed to environmental justice. We're working, as I said, to end racism. And all of this we do because of our faith in God, our belief that love, forgiveness, kindness, justice, and peace is the right way. I believe most Americans agree with us. Dr. King said that our only hope today is to recapture the revolutionary spirit and declare eternal hostility to racism, poverty, and militarism. Friends, we have a lot of work to do. I hope you'll pray for us as we go forward. Thank you.